Hello, my name is Koschel and I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago, where I write my dissertation about the relation between Kant and Hegel. This talk will be about absolute mechanism and in what way it is a rudimentary form of self-determination. And maybe short disclaimer, so I've never recorded myself before, and I also never made a PowerPoint presentation of any philosophical contribution, so please forgive me this or that mishap. I did think, however, that because given this new medium people can stop at will, that I tried at least to move rather swiftly, so that depending on how people feel, they can stop themselves rather than I have to predict when they need a break. Good. So to motivate the talk, the topic of this talk, we can plausibly say that freedom is can be understood or should be understood as self-determination. So is teleology. Hegel says so in the teleology section. But now, interestingly, Kant, at least how I understand him, has shown in the third antinomy that freedom goes beyond our finite forms of cognition. These finite forms of cognition involving cause and effect, i.e. mechanical or external determination. So self-determination and mechanical determination do not go together. Hegel takes up that point in the mechanism chapter, namely that external determination is central to the concept of objectivity or the world, while it does not live up to the demands of self-determination, which is actually needed in order to think a totality as the world. But for the purposes of this talk, one question is, how exactly does Hegel take up this Kantian point? If Hegel takes up that Kantian point, and the Kantian point has already exhausted what could be said about mechanistic interaction, then it becomes a bit puzzling why the mechanism chapter in Hegel's Science of Logic moves on beyond the point where Hegel has taken up the Kant's point. Because Hegel takes up Kant's point in the mechanical object, but there are two more sections of the mechanism chapter, namely the mechanical process and absolute mechanism. And I think these two further forms are actually relevant for understanding how freedom can be realized in the world. And this has something to do with a reconception of solar systems. For Kant, solar systems can be cognized with our finite forms of cognition, specifically the third category of relation, mutual interaction. Whereas for Hegel, I think, solar systems already go beyond Verstandesdenken, the mere understanding. So, central claims of my talk are, for one, in the third antinomy, Kant shows a pernicious regress that is internal to mechanical causation. Hegel takes up that point in the Science of Logic and expresses it as the contradiction of the mechanical object. Secondly, as the third form of mechanism, I claim, absolute mechanism is a realization of the concept, that is, of self-determination. So, regarding the second claim, why is that interesting? Well, for one, it shows how self-determination can be realized in the world in a simpler and more rudimentary way than, for example, organisms. Secondly, that is helpful for seeing how self-determination does not go against external determination or then causal laws, but rather is a higher form of determination that fills or uses what is left undetermined by external or mechanical causation. Thirdly, showing that absolute mechanism is a realization of self-determination demonstrates the character, formal character, as it were, of the mechanism chapter, that the progress through the stages follows the stages of immediacy, mediation, and self-mediation. Good. So much about motivation for the second half. Now to the first half of the talk, which means to first talk about the third antinomy, or first address the third antinomy. So I seek to give a reading of the third antinomy that brings out why the antinomy is a pressing issue. I find this often in the secondary literature a bit wanting. I don't quite understand why the antinomy is such a pressing issue in the first place. Maybe we can be happy that Kant has liberated us from this weird antinomy that we never bought in the first place. Such a reading I find unsatisfying, so I try to give one that really brings out why we would think it is an antinomy in the first place. Secondly, I seek to give a reading that is textually sound. I do contradict, for example, Eric Watkins' understanding of causation, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. Thirdly, I want to give a reading of the third antinomy that allows for seeing how Hegel takes up the third antinomy in the mechanism chapter of the Science of Logic. So, to consider the third antinomy, we have to start with the second analogy, out of which the third antinomy can be developed. So the guiding question of the second analogy is, I think, how can appearances be objective? And that means to ask, how can appearances have a location in time? If they don't have a location in time, they're not objective. So this the argument starts, I think, with this crucial premise or crucial point. If a succession of representations is not ordered, then it is merely subjective. So in order to get objectivity, we need order. Order is expressed, however, by means of the category of causation. Concretely, it is so by a preceding appearance being the condition for the appearance in question. Thereby is objectivity vouchsafed. And I mean, to get more into the weeds of the second analogy, of course, Kantian events are changes of a substance, and they are caused by the action of a different substance. But I think we can condense this for the purposes of this talk to saying one appearance is the condition of another. This point, as I just mentioned it about the second analogy, is expressed in the following quote from Kant. That's at the end of the second analogy. In the same way, then, that time is the a priori sensible condition of the possibility of a continuous progress of that which exists to that which follows it, the understanding, by means of the unity of apperception, is the a priori condition of the possibility of a continuous determination of all positions for the appearances in this time, through the series of causes and effects, the former of which inevitably draw the existence of the latter after them, and thereby make the empirical cognition of temporal relations valid for all time, universally valid for all time, thus objectively valid. So we have here exactly the elements. For objectivity, we need location in time, and for that we need causation. That this causation is between substances is expressed in this nice quote, actually from the third analogy, but looking back onto what was established in the second analogy. Quote, the relation of substances in which the one contains determinations, the ground of which is contained in the other, is the relation of influence. So, to the third antinomy, I think it is helpful to unfold the third antinomy by means of the notion of objectivity. For one, we've just seen in the second analogy that the objectivity of an appearance entails that there is another appearance. Let's call the first one A and the second one B. And the action of appearance B determines any change of the appearance A. However, if that action of appearance B is not supposed to be merely subjective but objective, then there has to be an appearance C, the action of which determines that change in appearance B. So the action of appearance B is supposed to be an objective change. Otherwise it would be merely subjective. Well, for that, there has to be a cause, namely an appearance C, an action in appearance C. However, if that action in appearance C is supposed to be objective and not merely subjective, and so on. So, conceiving of the objectivity of appearances actually sends us down an infinite regress. So now to bring in another dimension of objectivity, we would also say that objectivity, or the world, or nature, I think for the purposes here we can treat these as the same, even though Kant, of course, differentiates between world and nature. The objectivity is fully determinate. When we consider what we take objectivity or the world to be, then there are no gaps. In Leibniz's term, nature makes no jumps. So for the third antinomy now this is relevant, because if nature or objectivity is fully determinate, then the chain of causes must be complete. Otherwise we would not have full determinacy in objectivity. But the only way, we've just seen that by the causation as laid out in the second analogy, we get the infinite regress. Thereby we don't get full determinacy, because as it were every step adds more determinacy, at least we might think so. So there must be a kind of cause that is different than the kind of cause laid out in the second analogy. This is, of course, the thesis of the third antinomy, namely, without such a different kind of cause, no full determinacy. That's at least how I would motivate this. So, if the action of a cause is objective, however, that's what the antithesis now points out, then there must be a cause of that cause. So this alleged different kind of cause would not be objective. It would not have a location and time. It would not be temporally located to the world. And so there cannot be this kind of cause that is supposed to vouchsafe the full determinacy of objectivity, because there cannot be a different kind of cause as laid out in the second analogy for the reasons just mentioned. Yeah, and that is the antithesis, as I said. So, on the one hand, in order to vouchsafe objectivity, the chain of causes must be complete. On the other hand, in order to vouchsafe objectivity, every cause must have a cause in turn, so that it is objective by having a temporal location. So both claims arise at the same time, and depending on how we feel on each day, we will go from the one to the other, and whenever we embrace one, we will after a while be moved to the other one, oscillating forever, and that is a sign of reason being at war with itself. Good. Now, regarding Kant's solution or resolution, I would think you can express this as saying, well, it's a bit unclear what exactly it says, but one way to put it is, well, objectivity is not really fully determinate after all. That's how we dodge that part of the antinomy, because the full determinacy is merely a regulative idea. This is a bit puzzling to understand, and Hegel's verdict on this is that this just means to affirm the contradiction of the world of appearances, which means the world conceived along mechanical lines. Some Hegel quotes for that from the lectures on the history of philosophy. With this, in section on Kant, of course, with this transcendental idealism, the contradiction remains in place. Then he goes about this, the contradiction is pushed into the mind, and then after that, Hegel says, in that way, Kant's solution, however, the contradiction is not resolved. It remains as before. So, moving to the science of logic, specifically the mechanism chapter. So I was construing the third antinomy in terms of objectivity, and I think this is faithful also to Hegel's rendition of matters, the matters here, because mechanism is the first, that is, immediate form of objectivity. So the task at this point of the science of logic is to think objectivity. And I think that can be glossed as saying we want to determine objectivity. So this link is, I think, relevant between when it means to think a form of the science of logic means to determine it. This is how I would understand this. If you disagree, I'd be very interested in that discussion. So we are confronted with the task of thinking objectivity in its immediacy, And that is what the mechanism chapter is or does. So what is the first thought of objectivity? Well, for one, we can say it comes out of, just a quick gloss, it comes out of the disjunctive syllogism. In the disjunctive syllogism, the mediation of judgment is mediated away, like we can say. And so objectivity is the thought of an immediate totality. And that is what this quote says. Since objectivity is the totality of the concept that has returned into its unity, an immediate is something immediate, well, is thereby posited, which is in and for itself that totality, and is also posited as such. So, objectivity is an immediate totality. Furthermore, this immediate totality is comprised of fully determinate, self-standing objects. And this is what gives rise to the mechanism chapter and specifically the first part of that, section of that, the mechanical object. So this is, we get that point in the following quote. But on account of the objective totality, because we want to think in objective totality, the differentiated moments are complete and self-subsistent objects. So one way to put this is to say, well, thinking in totality determinately means to think a multitude. And this multitude are these complete and self-subsistent objects. Now continue the quote. That these objects consequently, even in connection, relate to one another as each standing on its own, each maintaining itself in every combination as external. This is what constitutes the character of mechanism, namely that whatever the connection that obtains between the things combined, the connection remains one that is alien to them, but that does not affect, one that does not affect their nature. So, starting from there, how do we get the self-movement of thought through or of mechanism going? I think we do so by asking the following question. How can we understand the manifold of objects that objectivity is comprised of? How can we think that manifold? How can we determine it? So this means to ask, how do these objects look like? What are their determinations? And that means, how are these objects determined? And we cannot presuppose that these objects have any determinations, because that would go against the method of the science of logic. So the determination has to come from somewhere. Their determinations have to be mediated. So we have two options for how these objects have their determinations, either internally or externally. Maybe you could say that the internal is anyway a non-starter, but we can run this through, I think. How could an object be internally determined? Well, by considering it as an object. And as we started, that object or objectivity, I mean, in the Encyclopedia Logic, this section is just called the object, so there this move goes a bit more smoothly even. So we can consider it as an object that is a totality, because that is the thought at hand that we have available in order to determine what an object is. It is comprised of more objects. And, well, so we could kind of think of this as like something akin to a Russian doll structure, where like within the Russian doll is like many more Russian dolls, and when you open them, there are again many more Russian dolls. I mean, this metaphor has its limits, however, sometimes illustrations are nice. So, but now the question, of course, just reiterates, well, how? We wanted to know, how is the original object determined? Well, the original object is determined by means of the objects it is comprised of. So how are these objects determined? Well, they are objects, and as we've seen, objects are a totality that is comprised of objects. So we just get a regress and we don't get anywhere. Our answer, our question, how is the object determined, does not get answered. Therefore, this attempt fails. Internal determination not available at this level of the science of logic at the beginning of mechanism. So the question is, how could an object be externally determined? So what does that mean? It means an object, or the object at hand, is determined by an object that is outside of it. So the question is, how is this other object determined? Well, by an object outside of it. And how is that other object determined? You get the hang of it. So this is, I think, how Hegel takes up Kant's point in the third antinomy. And the result of this is that the mechanical object cannot be determined in this way. And so we could say the mechanical object is a thought that cannot be thought. And that's a contradiction. So we can say with the means that are available at this point of the science of logic and the mechanical object, it is not possible to spell out objectivity, i.e. to make good on the task to think a totality of, quote, complete and self-subsistent objects, as we had this in the, quote, on slide 14, the, let's say, definition or the character of mechanism slide. So, as we've seen, objectivity entails to think, or the thought of objectivity entails to think a manifold of such objects. That means, if there is a manifold, there must be a difference between any two objects. Yet, quote, since the determinateness of an object lies in another, there is no determinate diversity separating the two. Central point in when Hegel states the contradiction of the mechanical object. And that means that with the means of the mechanical object, we have to think a manifold of objects, yet we cannot think any diversity between objects. So that's a contradiction. So that objectivity cannot be determined by means of external determination, that is by mechanical causal means, remains the backdrop for the rest of the mechanism chapter, and I think all higher forms of determination that come after it, all the forms that come after the mechanical object, be them solar systems or animals or thinking beings, they are more localized forms of determination, if you want, and they don't flout anything that happens in the mechanical object in this, I don't know, let's say space as laid out here. However, the space is also not very interesting, if you want. We can always go spatially or temporally further away. We can do this by means of external causes, but this does not by itself give us any more determinacy. Our questions of how an object is determined do not get answered in that way. That is why we have to move on in the science of logic beyond the mechanical object. Yet, as I wanted to say, this essential indeterminacy that we can always go further away spatially and temporally, this remains in place. It's just of no interest anymore later. It's not like, when it comes to, I don't know, determining life or thought, that we could spatially always move further away is not, that's besides the point, you can say. Yeah, so it has no significance. Okay. So much for the contradiction of the mechanical object. I think the central point here being that objectivity cannot be thought along the lines of external determination or mechanical causation. Kant has already made that point, kind of, in the third antinomy, and Hegel takes it up, and in the way just shown, but he also says, well, it is just a contradiction. And this contradiction is exactly what makes us move on in the science of logic. While this essential indeterminacy of objectivity when thought along external lines or mechanical lines, merely mechanical lines, will remain the backdrop for the forms to come. So now to the second part of the talk, in which the first part will play a role. In what way, if any, does absolute mechanism realize the concept, realize self-determination? So, in case, I don't know if this is a controversial thesis, I hope it's not, but in case this needs justification, the concept is self-determination. Here, one quote where this is put very nicely: the concept as absolutely self-identical negativity is self-determining, but especially if you go for things like, oh, the concept is self-negation and so on, then such quotes are all over the place, so I hope it's not controversial that the concept is the form of self-determination. Good. With that in mind, what speaks in favor of absolute mechanism, in some sense realizing the concept? There are 4 ways in which I want to argue for them. First way, I want to argue for it structurally. So the last forms of judgment and syllogism realize the concept. Judgment and syllogism are the chapters that precede the mechanism chapter, and throughout, well, at least the logic of the concept, the last form of whatever chapter we are considering realizes the concept to some degree, I think. So the last form of judgment and syllogism realizing the concept gives us an indication that also the last chapter, the last section of mechanism, will realize the concept. Secondly, I want to argue via the concept of totality. Totality is a central concept for the science of logic, I think. I would like to argue that even the whole book can be considered as an attempt, successive attempts to think what a totality is. A totality can be thought by self-determination. This is, I think, a central claim to the science of logic. Thereby, we need the concept in order to think a totality. So what I want to do in the second way is to show that absolute mechanism has the form of a totality, and specifically solar systems have the form of a totality, and they do so by having a holistic structure. So next way to argue for absolute mechanism, in some sense realizing the concept, is textually. That just means I will give some quotes from absolute mechanism, where Hegel says something that either says directly or at least suggests very strongly that the concept is realized. Fourth way, I would call conceptually, and that means by retracing the self-movement of thought through the mechanism chapter, we come to see why absolute mechanism realizes the concept. I mentioned this before with these 3 stages: immediacy, mediacy, and self-mediation or self-determination. Good. First way. So this, as I said, is only an expectation that absolute mechanism in some sense realizes the concept, but I think it's a good one. So starting with the judgment of the concept. How does the judgment of the concept realize the concept? It does so by bringing all 3 aspects of the concept into play, and these are, all 3 moments, these are individual, particular, universal. The judgment of the concept relates an individual via its particularity to its universal. Example for this would be this olive tree, an individual, because it blossoms in early spring, particularity, is a good olive tree or a healthy olive tree or behaves like olive trees should, thereby relation to the universal olive tree. This relation of all 3 moments of the concept is not present in earlier forms of the judgment. Thereby, judgment of the concept realizes the concept. Quote, but the judgment of the concept is instead objective, and, as contrasted with the others, it is the truth, for it rests on the concept precisely in its determinateness as concept. 2 more quotes for making my case here. Secondly, quote, this judgment is now truly objective. This is about the apodictic judgment, and the olive tree judgment I gave was an apodictic judgment. Or it is the truth of the judgment in general. Finally, the subject and predicate are in the apodictic judgment each the whole concept. So I hope this is a good case for the apodictic judgment realizing the concept. It's now syllogism of necessity. More specifically, the disjunctive syllogism realizes the concept in the following way: by the form of self-determination of a universal. This is something we have present in the disjunctive syllogism. This universal is exhaustively particularized into species or particular determinations. That's also something we want for the concept to be realized. Thirdly, this is interesting for the transition to objectivity, in a way that form and content are not external to each other anymore. And finally, in a disjunctive syllogism, full determinacy is reached. Good, so quotes for that. The disjunctive syllogism is in general the determination of universality. Its middle term is the A as genus and as perfectly determined. So we have here a perfect determination, or I think full determination, it comes out better in the German, vollkommen bestimmtes, of universality. This is one aspect of the concept, and it is realized in the disjunctive syllogism. And this comes out more clearly in the second quote, that the disjunctive syllogism realizes the concept, namely, quote, with the disjunctive syllogism, the concept in general has been realized. So that I think makes a good case that the last forms of judgment and syllogism realizes the concept, and so gives us a good indication that the last form of mechanism will do so as well. Next, so much for these structural reasons. Next way, via the concept of totality. So here I want to argue a bit more systematically why absolute mechanisms, specifically solar systems, are a totality. And if they are a totality, then they have to be thought by means of the concept or by means of self-determination. So one question at the center of the science of logic: what does it mean to think a totality? Something that has nothing outside of it. For that we need the concept or self-determination. So put the question differently: how can we think a totality? This is the question that we have at the beginning of objectivity. Recall from the beginning of objectivity, since objectivity is the totality of the concept that has returned into its unity, an immediate is thereby posited, which is in and for itself that totality, and is also posited as such. I said this before, objectivity means to think that totality, spell out what that means, that we have here an immediate totality. So, regarding totalities, to jump a bit ahead to life, I think for Hegelians it is uncontroversial that organisms show us what it means that a totality is realized in the world, a localized totality realized in the world. Sounds like a contradiction, but we've seen already we have to affirm contradictions. Some, I mean not every, but some, the necessary ones. And this holds contra Kant, who thinks that we cannot think organisms as realized totalities that would go beyond our finite forms of cognition. And we have seen that in the third antinomy, and also in the contradiction of the mechanical object, namely that a totality cannot be thought by means of external determination. For there is no closure to a chain of causes. That, however, would have to happen if we were to actually think a totality. So in order to think a totality, a different form of determination has to come into play, and that is self-determination. Good. So in what way do we find a form of a totality in absolute mechanism? I want to consider for that question to consider the concrete case of solar systems. In order to bring out the point, I will compare solar systems with organisms. So that leads to the first question: in what way is one organism a totality? I only want to consider one organism because the organism's interaction with the environment and with other organisms of the same sort, i.e. nourishment and procreation, they can be put aside for this comparison. Solar systems don't do such things, at least as far as I know. So regarding the first question, the first part of the comparison, in what way is one organism a totality? It is so by being a localized self-determining whole. For an organism is a purposive whole. It is a purposive whole because when we consider the constitution of the organism, we look at its parts, its organs, and we find that in order to understand the organs, we have to take the whole into account. In order to understand the function of each organ, the whole organism needs to be invoked. So we have a purposive whole here, and we have a whole prior to the parts structure in organisms. So that's how organisms are a totality. So, in what way is a solar system a totality? quite similarly by being a localized and self-determining whole. Of course, the self-determination only in the rudimentary way, because no nourishment and procreation, but it has a whole prior to the part structure. How is it that a solar system has a whole prior to the part structure? Well, for the following reason being universal gravitation, as expressing Newton's third law of motion, that action equals reaction. So Hegel has his qualms with Newton, but I think on that point he is d'accord, namely that according to universal gravitation, if we want to be completely precise, actually in order to determine the motion of any body, we would have to take all other bodies into account, because all material bodies stand in mutual gravitational interaction with each other. So specifically for solar systems, this comes out in, if we want to, in the following way, if we want to determine the motion of a planet precisely, we have to take all other planets into account because of the gravitational forces that the other planets exert on the planet in question. Of course, the sun gets the lion's share in this determination, but a highly precise equation would have to take all other planets and the sun into account. So they would have to, their mass and distance would have to figure in this equation. And that accounts for a solar system having a whole prior to the part structure, because I cannot determine one part without taking the whole into account. So I think this is a good point. This is my argument. And I think given this point, it would even make sense to say that a planet outside of a solar system is a planet merely homonymously. So, both organisms and solar systems are localized self-determining wholes. They both have a whole prior to the part structure. But of course, as mentioned, there are relevant differences, and I want to quickly discuss one further difference here that I think is illustrative. This further difference is solar systems do not heal themselves. It's an interesting thing about organisms that they heal themselves, which means when they are injured, then processes in the organism start that will restore the organism to a healthy state. And this is not going on in solar systems. In order to bring this out, consider the following scenario. A so far unknown object with sufficient momentum coming from outside the solar system hits a planet and, due to its momentum, dislodges that planet from its orbit. In that case, there won't be any processes in the solar system that would start in order to restore that planet to its original orbit. However, once that planet is dislodged from its orbit, that change would have an effect on the whole solar system. And that is now again an interesting point for illustrating the holistic structure of solar systems. So much for the discussion of the notion of totality and in what way solar systems are a totality. So now to the next line, which is the textual evidence, which means I'll just pull up a lot of quotes where Hegel says that in absolute mechanisms something like self-determination is going on. Here is the first one. This is all from the absolute mechanism section. The empty manifoldness of the object is now gathered first into the objective singularity, into the simple self-determining middle point. So, quote is about the middle point. It says, in contrast to the empty manifoldness of the object, that means the scenario we had at the mechanical object where all relations are external. Now, with the middle point, self-determination is happening. Good. Furthermore, quote, the unessential single bodies relate to one another by impact and pressure. This kind of relation does not hold between the central body and the objects of which it is the essence. Their externality of these inessential single bodies no longer constitutes their fundamental determination. So, in the first part, impact and pressure is basically the Cartesian model of mechanical interaction, of what's going on in mechanism. And that is compatible with what we had on slide 14, and I'll also have it on the next slide, of the externality of mechanical objects being the character of mechanism. So this does not hold anymore once we are at absolute mechanism. As it says here in the boldface, their externality no longer constitutes their fundamental determination. Relation between central body and the objects, of which it is the essence, is a different one. That is, I think, very striking. Here again, the quote we had before, where the externality is what constitutes the character of mechanism, as we saw in the quote before, does not hold anymore for absolute mechanism, at least when we consider the central body in relation to the objects it is related to. Now, also with respect to law, we see that things have changed with regard to absolute mechanism, and it's something like the concept is realized. This quote says quite directly about the universality that is the law. This reality of the law corresponds to the concept. And Hegel does not in the vicinity speak of any specific concept, so I think it is the concept that is meant here. Yeah, so we can also say the law-governed behavior of solar systems expresses the concept. I think this is an adequate application at this point. Good. Finally, absolute mechanism realizes the concept because it is understood by means of three syllogisms. Like the disjunctive syllogism, I take this to be a mark of the concept, that we have these three syllogisms. So this is from the encyclopedia. Like the solar system, the state, for instance, is in the practical sphere a system of three syllogisms. It is only through the nature of this joining together, through this triad of syllogisms with the same termines, that a whole is truly understood in its organization. So we also have the articulation of a whole here by means of these three syllogisms. Good, so much for the textual evidence, and now in the last 10 minutes I want to give a quick run through the progression of the mechanism chapter and thereby argue for absolute mechanism realizing the concept. This is of course difficult and takes time normally, which is why we will only go through central steps. Luckily, we have already done the first step when we discussed the contradiction of the mechanical concept, so we've already done a bit of work. So let's go back to where we left off, and where we left off in the mechanical object was the impossibility to think objectivity as a manifold of mechanical objects. So we hit upon this contradiction question, well, what do we now do? And now comes a move that I find a bit notorious, and I will give you a reading of it, but I'd be very happy about discussion of it. Also, by the way, about literature tips. So what is happening now is that in the science of logic, is in the mechanism chapter, we posit what we have thought so far. Quote, the mechanical process, that's what comes after the mechanical object, is the positing of that which is contained in the concept of mechanism, hence the positing in the first place of a contradiction. It follows from the just indicated concept, mechanical object, that the interaction of objects is the positing of their identical connection. This positing consists simply in giving to the determinateness which is generated the form of universality, and this is communication. So, what does this mean? In the mechanical object, we had this contradiction when we were considering an object being determined by another object, because we could never answer what the determination of the first object is. But by now just positing this contradiction, I think this means that from now on we will just consider all objects being determined by another object. Is a contradiction, but we don't care. We just affirm this. And by the way, I think this is also a way in which you could see that Hegel takes up Kant, because Hegel reads Kant as affirming the contradiction. Here we have it again. The contradiction is simply affirmed, and this is what constitutes mechanism, the world of appearances. So now all objects sharing that they are determined by another object means that this is something all mechanical objects share. They thus share a universal determination. So what we're positing is objects being determined by other objects while sharing in a universal. This is at least how I make sense of this quote. And if we consider objects as being determined by other objects while sharing a universal, then we think communication of determinations. That is, we think a manifold of objects that communicate things like momentum or electrical charge. So about the universals that get communicated, Hegel now says in the following quote, "Laws, morals, rational conceptions in general are in the region of the spirit communicable entities of this kind. They pervade individuals unconsciously imposing themselves on them. In the region of the body, such entities are motion, heat, magnetism, electricity, and the like." So this gives us a sense of how these universals look like that get communicated, and also, interestingly, it is a nice example for how mechanism goes on in spirit, can go on in spirit. So when we now consider objects as communicating universal determinations, we can, interestingly, adopt two vantage points. The first we could call the object-first approach, where the objects are at the forefront of our minds, and where we then say that these objects have a certain determination, for example, a certain momentum. Secondly, we can adopt the vantage point that we could call the universal-first approach, where not the objects, but the universal is at the forefront of our mind, and so we say that the universal is distributed among the objects. Quote for that: "What is communicated is as universal positively present in the particular objects, and particularizes itself only in their diversity." So, the result of this step is the following. Contra the original determination at the beginning of the mechanism chapter, there is now a unifying element among objects. This is that they share in a universal, for example, motion. Or, alternatively, we can say that the objects are the particularization of a universal, for example, motion. Good. So we are at the step of communication. Now there is a next step. This is basically the transition from formal to real mechanical process. Objects have a determination. This is what we think now, namely a universal that is particularized at the objects. Now, as I understand it, this now gets also posited. The universal determination that all the objects have is then reflected into the objects. Quote, "Now, further, since the determinateness is a posited one, and the concept of the object has gone back to itself through the process of mediation, the object contains the determinateness as one that is reflected into itself." So, I would understand this step in the following way. In the progression of the science of logic, we have arrived at a point where objects have universal determinations. That was the result of the formal mechanical process. Because we have arrived at this point, we can posit it now. And thereby, this result, that objects have universal determinations, is now taken up into our comprehension of what an object is. So loosely speaking, we can say it is now part of the definition of an object. And this is why we can say that the universal determination is now reflected into the object. Result of this step is having a universal determination is now internal to objects, part of their definition. So this allows us to finally make the transition to absolute mechanism, because this internality of the universal now plays a role in absolute mechanism in the following way. The result of the mechanical process, what we've just discussed, quote, "is the sublation of the determinateness, the positive reflection of it into itself, the determinateness that has withdrawn into itself, or the posited totality of the concept, the true singularity of the object." Furthermore, quote, This resulting immanent reflection, what we've discussed, the objective oneness of the objects is now a oneness which is an individual self-subsistence, the center. Secondly, the reflection of negativity is the universality, which is not a fate standing over against determinateness, but a rational fate, immanently determined, a universality that particularizes itself from within, the difference that remains at rest and fixed in the unstable particularity of the objects and their process. It is the law. So I hope how the discussion of the true singularity of the object gives rise to the center here, and secondly how the self-particularization of the universal that we've discussed before is now taking the shape of the self-determination of the universal, which is the law. So while incomplete, I hope this rush through the mechanism chapter gave a sense of the way in which absolute mechanism is a realization of the concept as the final form of mechanism. It is so, for one, by being the posited totality of the concept, the true singularity of the object, namely in the central object, as well as the self-determining universality in the law. And maybe interesting for the relation to teleology, here in absolute mechanism, the law is immanent to the objects and it's not opposed to it, as it will then be in teleology, where, because here in the absolute mechanism, the objects cannot but follow the law, whereas at the later stages it is possible for the... So, having seen the conceptual points about universality, the self-determining universality, and singularity, in absolute mechanism, I now want to bring the talk to a close by recapitulating using the concrete case of solar systems, bringing these points back to our minds. So, what I have argued for was that, like organisms, solar systems realize the concept, albeit in a more reduced, a more rudimentary way. While solar systems are not self-determination as spelled out to such a degree as in teleology or even life, they are a whole. That is, they exhibit a whole prior to the parts structure. Now, this higher form of determination, the self-determination in relation to the lower form of determination, namely external determination, to address this issue a bit, if we ask for a mechanical cause when asking where did the solar system come from, then we fall back to a lower form of determination than solar systems have. So this higher form of a solar system does not get addressed when we ask where did the solar system come from and are thereby asking for a mechanical, an external cause. So then we are back at the sphere of the regress of external causes as laid out by Kant in the third antinomy and by Hegel in the mechanical object. So as we've said, or as I've tried to argue, objectivity conceived along the lines of external determination is essentially So, as I've said before, I think it is helpful to think of this essential indeterminacy of objectivity conceived along mechanical lines as always forming the backdrop of higher forms of determination, like solar systems, organisms, or thinking beings. As I said, we can always go spatially or temporally further away, but that just does not touch on these higher forms of determination being higher forms of determination. And maybe on a bit more speculative note, that mechanical causation does not conflict with such higher forms of determination. This is the case because the mechanical world is just essentially indeterminate. So that is at least one part of it. It can never really conflict because it does not have the determinacy by itself to do so, as it were. When we really want to get a solar system into view, we don't consider external determination anymore. And that equally holds for organisms and thinking beings. Good. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.